Welcome to the FreightWaves Venture Capital Tech Summit here at FreightWaves. We're excited to have you. Joined with Steve Case to kick everything off, talk about what's happening in the startup community. Steve is the CEO and chairman of Revolution LLC, also is heavily involved in Rise of the Rest. That's a part of the Revolution brand, doing investment outside of the coastal cities, helping empower businesses that are a part of the third wave. Steve, welcome.
Great to be with you.
So Steve, you and I first got the opportunity to be together and meet when you came to Chattanooga for the Rise of the Rest tour. FreightWaves was excited. I was certainly excited to take home the prize as the Chattanooga winner. That process of leading up to building this tour, going out in a bus, what really inspired that?
Well, it really started about 10 years ago. I started getting involved in some initiatives to try to promote entrepreneurship, including, I was asked to chair an initiative called Startup America that was launched at the White House almost 10 years ago. And then about 6 years ago, we decided to hit the road and just visit some cities and see what was happening. And now we've done 8 bus trips, visited 44 cities. We've made investments now through our Rise of the Rest seed fund in over 150 companies in over 70 cities. And the more we got into it, the more we realized, like in the case of FreightWaves, they're great companies that are being built all over the country, yet most of the venture capital focus is on the coast. If you look at the data last year, 75% of venture capital went to just 3 states. California, New York, and Massachusetts. So, if you're in Chattanooga, or if you're in Detroit, or you're in Des Moines, or you're in Madison, or you're in Minneapolis, or Atlanta, or Denver, Phoenix, you can kind of name a lot of different cities. It's harder to get the venture capital to start and scale businesses, and that's what we're trying to change. It'll level the playing field, so everybody everywhere who has an idea has a shot at building a company, and in the process, we can create jobs and more drive economic growth in many parts of the country, not just a few parts of the country. Really give entrepreneurs who have this idea, as you did, a real shot at the American dream.
Is it an arbitrage opportunity in addition to obviously distributing capital to communities that aren't currently well represented? But does it give you guys as an investment in arbitrage?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's a classic supply-demand, and most of the venture capital is in Silicon Valley. There are great things happening in Silicon Valley, obviously, but because there's so much capital, they're focused in just a small number of entrepreneurs, a small number of companies. Classic supply-demand. The valuation of those companies tends to be on the high side, and the valuation of that same company was in Chattanooga or one of these other rising cities would be lower. But once the companies are successful, once they they break through and get to the point where they're getting acquired or going public, that regional arbitrage, that regional discount, if you will, evaporates. And so there is an investment thesis here that underlines what we're doing. We do believe we can generate top tier returns from a venture capital perspective by doing things a little differently than what other people are doing. In this case, looking for entrepreneurs in places that most venture capitalists will never visit. Now, we are hopeful, and we're seeing some signs of this, including because of this pandemic, that there are more coastal investors that are beginning to look at other opportunities. You're a great example with FreightWaves. We're obviously proud to invest through our Rise of the Rest fund in FreightWaves. Since then, there's been other venture capitalists from other parts of the country, not just from that region, that have backed that. We've seen that with many of our Rise of the Rest companies now. So we just hope to be a catalyst, shine a spotlight on cities that are rising, do what we can to drive more collaboration in those cities, create a culture around more risk-taking and a sense of possibility in those cities. Also try to solve what's a vexing talent problem in these cities. As you know, a lot of people growing up in these rising cities left because they felt if they wanted to be part of the innovation economy, they needed to go to a place like Silicon Valley. So they're kind of a brain drain in the last several decades from many parts of the country. We want to slow that brain drain, get people staying when they grow up or graduate from universities. And we also want to see a little bit of a boomerang of people who might have left returning. And some of that, I think, is getting triggered by this pandemic.
So Steve, you wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Third Wave, which was sort of the foundational element to the Rise of the Rest tour. You then went out on tour. You're almost 5 years into that book. What has changed or evolved since you wrote that? Any observations?
Yeah, it's actually finally happening. My experience with these things is certainly true with my own experience as an entrepreneur. as a co-founder of America Online 35 years ago this summer. At the time, we thought it was so obvious that everybody would want to be online. But when we got started back then, only 3% of people were online, and they're only online 1 hour a week. And it took a long time, actually, more than a decade before finally we broke through. So the lesson to me from that experience was that sometimes revolutions happen in more evolutionary ways. I think the same is true with the rise of the rest and this broader thesis around the third wave of the internet. I'd say since I wrote that book, some of the things I wrote about have started to happen. We are seeing a little more momentum, not as much as we'd like, but not as much as we need, but a little more momentum in terms of venture capital focused on these rising cities. We are seeing more companies recognize that the role of public policy and regulations in these sectors, healthcare, food and agriculture, things like that, there's a natural alignment there. Sometimes it's frustrating to entrepreneurs, frankly, because sometimes regulations slow you down. But the reality is, as a society, we are going to insist on the drugs that we're taking and the medical devices we're using and so forth are safe and effective. So there's going to be a regulatory component. So I think there's more of a recognition around that aspect. And I think there's also more of a recognition around because of the growing importance of technology, the growing importance of the internet, that policymakers are going to pay attention. And we've seen this recently, and not just in Washington, D.C., but also in Brussels. Some of the big tech companies are kind of being asked, are they doing the right thing for the country? Are they doing the right things for the world? And there's even now some kind of review, including a recent filing by the Justice Department, an antitrust filing against Google. I had written about that as well, that over time there would be a backlash to big tech, and that Silicon Valley needed to do a better job of engaging with policymakers proactively. So I think some of the things I wrote about then, even though it's still early, and we still, as I said, a little progress on Rise and Rest. We hope there's a lot more progress in the next decade. There's a little bit more recognition on the part of entrepreneurs and venture capitalists of the role of government and a little more respect for that. And we're starting to see some of the other dynamics I wrote about around the third wave of the internet kick in.
And one of the things you talked about in the book and also in subsequent interviews and discussions is you've talked about the fact that in the third wave, the internet is about industries that have historically been slower to adopt technology or slower to come online, and really this opportunity to take advantage of the tribal knowledge, the access to networks that's critical to these industries' success. I'm curious, certainly we recognize it at FreightWaves, coming from a community that's heavily invested in freight and logistics, but I'm curious, where are the other case studies where that's been successful in the investment you guys have made?
Well, as you say, FreightWaves is a perfect example, because when I tell people about the investment we made, and as creating a kind of a platform, almost like a Bloomberg for freight and logistics, people would presume, well, if it's kind of like Bloomberg, I guess it's in New York City, or I guess maybe it's in Silicon Valley. And no, it's in Chattanooga. And they say, well, why? Well, because actually some of the most important trucking companies are based in Chattanooga, and building a company to serve them and that understands the culture of that industry and having relationships that you can build on become critically important. And that's part of the thesis of the third wave. I mentioned the policy aspect, which I think is going to become much more important. The partnership aspect is going to become much more important as well. If you really want to innovate and take healthcare, for example, it's not so much about the software. Of course, that's important, but that's almost like the table stakes. The real action is how you can create alliances, how you get doctors and nurses to use it, and hospitals to integrate it, and health plans to pay for it, and regulators to allow it. That's going to be the difference between success and failure in these sectors. As a result, we're seeing some of the cities where healthcare is strong, whether in terms of the research universities like a Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, or the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, or Mayo in Minnesota, or MD Anderson in Texas. We're starting to see some ecosystems build around them, and we're also starting to see some ecosystems build around some of the big healthcare companies, like health payers, like United happens to be in Minneapolis. There's a number of important companies, HCA and others, in Nashville. So because of this growing importance of domain expertise, as you mentioned, because of the growing importance of partnerships to really scale these ideas, we think there's an opportunity in these rising cities that didn't exist in the second wave of the internet. But it's going to require capital to make sure these companies really get access to that jet fuel that allows them to take off and really kind of change the world. And they have to win this battle for for talent. And so there's a lot of aspects that need more attention. But we're quite optimistic that over the next 10 or 20 years, we will level the playing field, that the innovation, entrepreneurship, startups will be more dispersed, not just in a few places. And that will have a very positive impact in terms of those communities. And we think will generate kind of outsized returns for our investors.
I saw the impact of what you did for Chattanooga and certainly for FreightWaves, but it was interesting before you came and the tour came to Chattanooga, there was a level of cynicism and a lack of acceptance among the community members, folks that are not in logistics, to understand how important this sector is to the local economy and how big of an opportunity it is for us to, as you've described, the Silicon Valley of trucking or freight, to be here in this community. And we've seen a lot more, whether it's politicians that are rallying around this sector, even the local newspaper talks about it on a consistent basis. It was a huge industry, but largely ignored as a big growth sector. What do you see in other communities, or in Chattanooga specifically, after you guys leave? How does it impact the community, you think?
Well, Chattanooga is a perfect example of a rising city. There's some things that were bubbling and some dynamics that were really quite encouraging. But most people around the country didn't think of Chattanooga as a startup city, and most people in Chattanooga didn't think of Chattanooga as a startup city. And what we're trying to do, other than identify great companies like FreightWaves to invest in, is do what we can to catalyze stronger startup communities in as many places as possible. So our team spends a lot of time, really 6+ months before we come, and doing a lot of research, figuring out who the right people are. And then when we're there, part of our job, and even the reason we travel around the city in a bus, is we think of that as a convening platform. We can gather people together, and often people in that community have never met each other, and try to figure out some of the connections that can drive kind of collaboration. So it starts with getting people in the community, the mayors, the CEOs of the larger companies, to recognize the role startups play in creating jobs and being a magnet for talent, things like that. And also recognize that you can't just focus on the companies of the past. You can't just focus on the industries of the past. You can't just be looking in the rearview mirror. You have to focus on the future. The data there is pretty compelling. About half of the Fortune 500 companies turn over every 25 years. So if you're proud that in your community has some Fortune 500 companies, good for you. But half of those, statistically, are not going to be Fortune 500 companies 25 years from now. So you got to start plant some seeds, which is why it's called seed capital into some of those companies, and some of those will grow up to be the big companies of tomorrow. There's way too much focus on, particularly around the mayors and governors, who are trying to lure big companies to open an office or kind of a factory, or maybe in the case of Amazon, second headquarters surge, open up a second headquarters. And I understand why people in those roles feel like they need to do that, but focusing more on trying to unleash the startups that can be the next Amazons, I think, is where the real leverage is, and hopefully that will happen. And the last point I'll make is in different cities, including Chattanooga that we visited, while there are more people that are understanding the role of startups and entrepreneurs and appreciate and respect and even celebrate entrepreneurs, many parts of the country, they are kind of cynical. They are kind of skeptical. They are kind of suspicious. If an entrepreneur starts a company and it's not successful, that person is viewed as a failure, as opposed to somebody who took a risk and that one didn't particularly work, but maybe the next one would work. And the way I think about it, and I mentioned this in the cities we visited, is when you hear a startup pitch, do you focus on why it might be successful, or do you focus on why it might fail? Kind of just focus on the risk factors. One of the great things about Silicon Valley is they think about the art of the possible. Like, what if this is successful? What might that look like? Many parts of the country are more focused on what might go wrong as opposed to what might go right. So there's a cultural point as well that we're trying to work on, as well as the capital point and the talent point. But Chattanooga is a great example of a city on the rise, and frankly, FreightWaves is a great example of why it makes sense to invest in cities all across the country, not just in places like San Francisco, New York, Boston, where most of the venture capital is focused.
Well, it certainly ignited a lot of energy around logistics here in the community. Now the term Freight Alley is something that people are really talking about. It's showing up in, the governor, the mayor, the local newspaper refers to it on a consistent basis. So we're certainly proud you've been a part of that. And there's a lot of energy. Green Bay, Wisconsin is also trying to figure out how do they emulate Chattanooga in logistics, because they're also well positioned. You guys have made some investments, had an exit out of Green Bay that was actually tied to the logistics space.
Yeah, no, we're seeing this is rumbling now across the country that there is, when we first started this 6 years ago, people were like, what are you doing? And even a couple of years ago, 60 Minutes kind of followed us around and did a story that ran, I think it was last year. And that got a little bit more attention, but still people are pretty skeptical. Like, do you really think they're like great entrepreneurs, like that are going to build really successful, valuable companies in a place like Chattanooga? And we said, yeah, we do. And if you look at also where the Fortune 500 companies are, most of them are in the middle of the country, not on the coast. So we just have this disconnect. This last phase of the second wave of the internet, when it was just about software and apps and things like that, Google, Facebook, those kind of companies, that's when Silicon Valley really rose to such prominence, arguably even dominance. But as you well know, because you are one, they're great entrepreneurs building great companies all across the country. We need to understand that, spotlight them, celebrate them, invest in them, be customers of them, partner with them, help them as they scale their businesses. And if we can do that, we'll have a lot of cities on the rise. We'll have a lot of cities where there is more economic growth and job growth and a sense of hope and possibility. And we'll have a country that actually will be more united, because everybody hopefully someday will feel like they have a role in the future, as opposed to right now. A lot of people in a lot of parts of the country do feel kind of left out. They do feel kind of left behind. And the startups and tech and venture capital is not the only answer to that, obviously, but it's part of the answer to that. And we need more people to focus on that.
Steve, how do we get more funds to follow what you guys have done? How do we get more funds to come to places like Chattanooga to make investments in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and Northwest Arkansas? How does that process start after you guys have done a tour, just organically?
Well, the best thing to do is actually something you need to do, which is build FreightWaves into a massively successful, massively valuable, iconic company in Chattanooga. And the reason, I'm serious about it, the reason is, and I saw this even building AOL outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. The time we started 35 years ago, Washington, D.C. was not a startup city. It was not a tech city. It really was a government town. We had government contractors and lobbyists and so forth. Not much in the business world, and certainly not much in the startup world. The success of AOL, going from dozens of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people, had a spin-off impact, both in terms of what's happening directly in the tech ecosystem and also other things. People then suddenly were buying houses, and so there was construction jobs, and new schools were being built, new roads were being built, and you saw the city on the rise. So I saw it personally. More recently, there's a company that we visited in Indianapolis, Exact Target. Started there and scaled there. It was a little harder for them to raise capital. It was harder for them to get be taken seriously by potential customers. But eventually, it got to the point where they went public, and then Salesforce bought them. And now it's Salesforce's second largest office outside of San Francisco. They have 2,000 Salesforce employees in Indianapolis. And some of the people, including Scott Dorsey, the founder there, has gone on to start an accelerator and a venture firm and launch several dozen other companies. And now Indianapolis, particularly around enterprise software, is rocking and rolling. So it was a success of Exact Target that really did that. Dell had a similar impact in Austin. Microsoft had a similar impact in Seattle. So there's some things we can do and are trying to do in terms of getting more venture capitalists to pay attention and spotlight these entrepreneurs and make investments, and then build relationships to bring in kind of follow-on investors for the later rounds. But nothing beats success. And so the best thing you can do for us is to have FreightWaves be one of those iconic companies. And the best thing you can do for Chattanooga is to have that success, which will wake up a lot of people in Chattanooga and say, I didn't think we could do this as a community. I didn't think we could really build significant kind of tech companies that create a lot of value and create a lot of jobs. And suddenly when people see that, it opens their eyes, and they're more willing to make angel investments locally. They're more willing to be early customers and partners, things like that. Momentum begets momentum. You just have to kickstart it. And we're doing what we can to put the little kindling on the fire, but we really need to see the fires roaring from companies like FreightWaves.
And liquidity events obviously drive recycling of capital, and that certainly helps. If you think about a lot of discussion around the Black Lives Matter, what happened this summer around tension, you guys have doubled down on investing in Black founders. You want to talk a little bit about your largest ever tour that you guys are doing virtually?
Yeah, we're launching this in early December, and there were several days, including a pitch competition on December third. And you go to the revolution.com site or just search on Rise of the Rest, fund, and you'll get all the details. Hopefully, people will participate. The reason we're doing this, I talked about the venture capital data in terms of place, that 75% goes to 3 states. But there's also some rather sobering data in terms of people. And if you look at Black founders, for example, Black Americans represent 14% of our population, but Black founders, entrepreneurs, get less than 1% of venture capital. So there's an opportunity to do a lot better, and we think we need to focus on that, and that's one of the things we're trying to do. If you look at women, there's another dynamic that's pretty interesting. That they're half our country, but women founders get less than 10% of venture capital. So it does matter where you live. It does matter what you look like. It does matter who you know. And we're trying to change that dynamic as well, level the playing field there as well. And so that's what led us to launch this virtual tour. We obviously can't get on a bus, a virtual tour to really spotlight Black founders. And we have hundreds have already applied. We've already have more than 100 venture capitalists who've joined us on this effort, that agreed to meet with the entrepreneurs. And so every entrepreneur who applied will be connected with venture capitalists. We'll pick, obviously, the best ones, have a national pitch competition. The winner will get a $1 million investment. The 2 runner-ups will each get a $500,000 investment. But it's not just about those particular companies. It's about how do you create a broader network, extending what we've built with Rise the Rest. So it's not just focused on place. In this case, it's also focused on race.
Steve, what are the opportunities as you think about moving in a post-COVID world where places like, at least Twitter has blown up with a lot of people talking about San Francisco as we knew it is over, New York is changing. I'm not sure how much of that is short-term or just a little bit of Twitter drama versus actual substance. But it does seem like there's a lot more interest in moving into other communities. Seems like venture capitalists that I talk to actually appreciate the fact that we're in Chattanooga and startups are not in the coastal cities because their capital goes a lot longer than it does in those cities. Do you think this is a permanent element? Has this been a transition?
I think some of the, as you say, some of the media focus or Twitter focus on this is a little overblown. The idea that suddenly San Francisco is going to get hollowed out, or there's going to be a mass exodus from New York City. I think that's kind of crazy. I think most people who left will return, but a lot of people will stay where they are, either working for their current company, because a lot of Silicon Valley companies, Facebook, Square, and others have put in place pretty flexible remote work policies. So some will say, come to think of it, maybe where I kind of decided to settle down for the last 7-8 months, maybe I want to stay here. My family's kind of happy here. Maybe I'm closer to family members. I kind of like the lifestyle. I kind of like the cost of living. And kind of a bunch of things I kind of like about this. Maybe we'll stay and initially work for the current company that they're affiliated with, but then over time maybe see an opportunity in that city and either join a startup or maybe even start their own companies. So I think if we look back in history, obviously this pandemic is terrible, with nearly 250,000 people dead and tens of millions of jobs lost, et cetera. But there might be a silver lining here, where coming out of this, there really is an opportunity for some of the dynamics we're talking about to accelerate. I think this has kind of been a shake the snow globe moment for people, as well as for companies, as well as for communities. And I think the idea that we're going to get back to normal, I don't think we're going to get back to normal. We're going to create some kind of new normal. And my hope, and frankly my expectation, is part of that new normal will include this dispersion of talent and capital, so backing more startups in more places, and hopefully also do that in a more inclusive way, so Black founders, brown founders, female founders also have a shot.
Steve, the IPO market's been really hot this year, led by everything from SPACs to some high quality cloud companies that have done exceptionally well in the IPO market. Do you think that cycle is going to continue, or do you think that this is an event that is going to fizzle out?
Well, we've seen it firsthand. A couple of our companies have gone public. One through a SPAC, DraftKings, which is I think the most successful SPAC ever, went out 4 or 5 months ago, done super well. Also, more recently, a couple of months ago, a company that we backed focused on e-commerce called BigCommerce, an e-commerce platform company, went public, quite successful. I think actually also might be one of the most successful IPOs of of the year. So we've seen it, and it's excitement around the public markets around growth opportunities pretty significant. Now, part of that's because interest rates are so low. People really do need to invest in the tech sector and the growth companies more than they might have otherwise. So that's part of the reason there's more capital, and I think most of that will continue. At the same time, I think the markets were a little premature in declaring the pandemic over, and I think there clearly is a growing risk. We're seeing this in some countries now of a second wave, and that will result in some additional kind of market jitters. But if you take the long view over the next 3 to 5 years, there's a lot of things happening that are going to change. Some of the biggest industries in the world, healthcare as an example, are up for grabs, and there's going to be a lot of innovation, a lot of disruption, much of that led by startups. And so backing these startups will continue to be a lucrative thing for investors, and doing it in a more inclusive way, not just backing the companies in Silicon Valley, not just backing white male founders, but having a more inclusive view of that is, I would think, where the biggest opportunities will be going forward. Part of what we see, and you're a perfect example again of it, given your family history in the trucking industry. Entrepreneurs see a problem they want to solve, or see an opportunity they want to seize, and usually it's because of their own experience. And so the experience people have in Chattanooga or other cities is different than the experience growing up in say, a Manhattan. And that leads you to different kind of hypotheses as an entrepreneur. And that's also true if you're coming from a more diverse community. And so that's why we need to make sure we're backing those entrepreneurs. Some of those entrepreneurs will have the ideas that will create the most successful investments.
Steve, when you guys go and you have these tours and you have these founders pitch you and your partners at Rise of the Rest, what is it that, in terms of common themes of the companies that you guys invest in, is there any commonality in that, or is it just diversity? What do you guys look for when you're actually backing a company?
Well, Revolution has 3 parts. Revolution Growth, which is sort of the later stage growth investments, and that's where companies like DraftKings and BigCommerce and Clear and Sweetgreen, many other companies are in that growth portfolio. We also have Revolution Ventures, more of a Series A, sometimes Series B fund, and then we have the Rise of the Rest seed fund. Both growth and ventures do have certain sectors they're focused on. Rise of the Rest is place-based, so we're open to really any sector, and so it is a fairly diverse mix of sectors that we've invested, because the places we're investing, I mentioned we've been so far invested in 150 companies in 70 cities. Those places each have different dynamics, and there are different industries based in those places that we think give them the opportunity to build on that. And it's also part of this broader thesis we've been talking about around the third wave of the internet. That first wave, obviously, companies like AOL were part of, is getting everybody online. The second wave, once everybody's online, you didn't have to focus on building the on-ramps and the servers and the infrastructure. It was done. So it really became the apps and software on top of the internet. And the third wave is really integrating the internet in everyday life and doing things that are really quite innovative that can improve people's lives and disrupt big industries in our economy. That disruption is going to happen everywhere, and that's why our seed fund has a broad view of sectors.
Steve, I was certainly excited that we won the Rise of the Rest. I was also, having taken in venture capital before, I also put a little level of cynicism, healthy cynicism, and I will say that the fund, what you guys have done, what David Hall and company have done at Rise of the Rest have been profound, have impacted our business in profound ways. And I know it certainly has impacted the community here in Chattanooga. So I do applaud you and really appreciate your support of our business and, frankly, the whole mission. And hopefully, to your point, we can have a successful outcome in our business, continue to scale, and recycle not only talent, but capital here in Chattanooga.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind. And we're obviously proud to be investors in FreightWaves, and part of what we've been trying to do, you mentioned, David, is build a network of these entrepreneurs. So you in Chattanooga or the other entrepreneurs in other cities aren't quite as lonely. We can connect them together. How do we connect the regional venture capitalists together? How do we connect the community builders together? Create that network effect that is, again, one of the things that is strong in Silicon Valley, but weak in many parts of the country. So we've made some progress. We still have a lot of work to do in the coming years, and we're hopeful that companies like FreightWaves will make our lives a little easier, because the success you'll have will really inspire other people in your community, other people around the country, and the coastal investors to pay more attention to what's happening in these rising cities like Chattanooga. So thank you.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Exciting place. I can't think of a more relevant person to kick off today's Freight Tech Venture Summit.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Steve.